Hey folks, welcome to Transitional Podcast. My name is Mark. I'm joined by Bruce.
Nah, that joke's done, man. The merch has stopped selling. Mark, we should say thanks to Variety Bar in Glasgow, No Mean Radio, thanks to Sean and Gail. I'm Chris, and we're not alone.
We're not alone.
Name yourself.
Name yourself. I'm Phil Eaglesham, but I go by the artistic name P6.
We'll come back to that in a moment. Audience.
Got
some bad news for you. You're a mess. At least on today's issue. For anybody that doesn't know, who hasn't bothered to read the title before they clicked it, we are covering the band Cabaret Voltaire. Phil, this was your choice. And I think probably 33% of you saw this week's subject and thought, oh, that's that kind of noisy industrial band. And then I think maybe 15% of people saw it and thought, are they like a 90s dancey acid thing? And then maybe another 15% were like, is that 80s band that were like a bit like Nine Inch Nails meets Prince? And then probably like
0.3%.
No. I think like a very hip 10% who drinking mono and shopping Mr. Ben, Glaswegians, you'll get that. Saw like, oh, the Dadaist performance art group from 1974. Maybe 3% of people, probably with dreadlocks, recognised them from their work with Al Jurgensen. And then maximum 2% of you who probably steal bones for your rituals thought, oh, that's that band that Coil like. And the thing is, you're all right. You're all correct. Because Cabaret Voltaire is no one thing. So this week we are hoping to clear up this band a bit, to disambiguate this band a bit for you and for ourselves, to get everyone on the same page or pages. We have, as we say, our extremely good friend Phil Eaglesham, P6, on the show. Phil has curated this. He's here to guide us like some kind of lithe and provocative Sherpa, the esoteric. And Phil, you are actually something of a tour guide yourself, aren't you?
Yeah, especially since I retired. I do musical walking tours in the city, and it has to be said, somebody messaged me this week saying, how do you actually live with yourself if you have to talk about hue and cry? Mm-hmm. And I didn't say to you earlier on, but actually, usually the put down, if I don't cast shade on my tour. My guests are lovely. Doesn't matter what they're into. It's like, whatever. It's a music tour, whatever music like. But it has to be said, if something surfaces, the worst put down I can usually use is, well, there's no canon of work. And with Cabaret Voltaire, there's a canon of work.
It's an almighty canon. I have to say, the hue and cry disc will not go down well with David Weaver. Fortunately,
God rest his soul.
Fortunately, he's not here today.
You know the line in there's a line in a Stretchheads song, Pat Kane, what a wank. I actually said that to him in Kelvin Grove Park once. That's how obnoxious the Stretchheads were.
So, for those of you that are like, I think I know this guy, you're like, Phil is the razor-throated and I would say razor-witted front person of Stretchheads, who you've mentioned, as well as De Salvo, as well as these days Omo. Do you pronounce it Omo?
Umo. It's sumo, as in umo, rather than
Umo.
Omo, as in homo. Also got a band called Security with my pal Joe Ahmed, so I'm not averse to some synth pop.
I was going to say, yeah, you have a number of other projects on the go. You're probably the nicest man to ever throttle the audience with a mic cable. And you're also, and I'm not saying this to butter you up, but you're a man of broad and deep musical learnings, especially when provocateurs pioneers and maybe pornographers are involved. I would probably put you in the same company as our beloved Italian professor of punk, Ferruccio.
Yeah, I've loved hearing his take on post-punk stuff. I would love to read his PhD, actually.
Yeah, you two guys actually have a lot in common when it comes to how invested you are in the music you love and how broad your understanding of the way things are interconnected are. So Phil, very quickly, how does today find you?
Life is really good. We've talked about this for a wee while.
That's what I like.
And actually, I've got some prep because Umo are away on Friday to do gigs in Leeds and London, so I packed early. I've sorted myself out.
Yeah, just back from Copenhagen.
Copenhagen.
Yeah.
Copenhagen.
Mark speaks Danish, so you can tell us.
Yeah. We use the merchant's port, incidentally, it's a direct translation of the word's Copenhagen. So.
We played Colossal Festival. We were treated most spectacularly. I was rocking a kind of turbo homo kind of sailor fuck outfit on stage, and they immediately got it.
Last time I think I saw you as a jester, or was it as a judge? I can't remember.
I'm the Mr. Ben of metal. So I just like mixing it up, and I just like bringing a little bit of. It's not about surprise, and I used to feel awkward sometimes when people are like, oh, what are you going to wear tonight? Like that was it. I'm like, I've got fucking 3 guys behind me that are going to blow your tits off. So I think that's what's more important.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just trying to kind of perform a wee bit and just do something different. And we stood out like a sore thumb. And I think at a festival,
you like
particularly,
that, and I think that's admirable.
I think it draws attention, but I think it's a calling card. You know, I'd said to them, they interviewed us in advance and said, "What does Doom Cabaret mean?" And I was like, "Well, you'll find out, because it is bringing a sense of fun and cabaret and the politics of cabaret and the queerness of cabaret into I would say it was quite a heteronormative space, but actually metal's really diverse now.
I think
it's fucking great.
The thing is, in a lot of ways, especially the audience of metal is very diverse. I think sometimes the way it's portrayed on stage can be, a little bit like one note.
There's definitely still an orthodoxy though, and I fucking hate orthodoxy.
Yeah. And I think that's why I say you enjoy that subversion, and I think it's commendable, because you were always one of those bands that if you were in a festival, like let's say you're at a festival and it's all kind of grinding you down a bit and you're getting a little bit numb to it, one of your projects would come on stage and just be that refresher, be that palate cleanser of like, wow, they totally changed the tone of this event. And I think that's actually really nice to see. Although it's happening more often these days. There's so many bands, even just in our own city of Glasgow, that are messing around with those kind of like templates, those traditional templates and aesthetics. So,
and there were a couple of surprises at the festival, like Hypergal, Japanese band from Tokyo, duo, really great. You know, Zan, new Berlin band that I hadn't heard of before. So, you know, there's definitely edges that are happening, and festivals, I think, particularly are working at trying to have quite a bit of diversity, bringing more women into the scene, having more queer identity. I think that's part of what's just kind of shaking it up a wee bit. And actually, audiences are really up for that.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, that's been really encouraging to see. There is one question that I am going to take it upon myself to clear up. P6, where did it come from?
Few things. I didn't bring it. We'll save it for another episode. I've actually got
the Coil episode.
I've got a letter from Jeff from Coil.
We're all scared of it. Folks, just so you know, we've been dancing around doing an episode, but every artist that Phil recommends is like a month's worth of like PhD level research. So, sorry,
nonsense. I've got a letter from Jeff, and I think I'd written off when I started psychiatric nursing. One of the staff nurses used to call me Flossie. So I was Phil Floss for a little while.
Right, okay.
I was tinkering around with a moniker, and then I just changed to P6. So letter P, 6 letters in my name, 6, the prisoner.
Yeah.
It just fitted. I was living in the psychiatric hospital in Paisley, because the first Stretchheads album, the address for correspondence is Care of Dyke Bar Hospital, so people thought we were patients.
Yeah.
And then, but I worked there, I lived there, I was doing my training. And I've got a letter back, and there's a letter for Jeff. We'll look at it, but it was like, oh, your new ever evolving moniker, blah blah. So I just used it, and it was short, and it just kind of fitted. Yeah. And I think it is that thing of like, I didn't need an alter ego, but I just wanted to create a little bit of a boundary with who I was in terms of at work. And I just wanted to have a bit of a kind of character. And I think that's what then evolved, I think, into taking a lot of risks on stage and being quite, which seems quite provocative. But I have spoken about it on other podcasts. It was really interesting as well. I worked all the way through AIDS and stuff as well, and there were very few queer people out in the scene, even in the most kind of anarchic fringes of where we were working as the Stretchheads. It just wasn't. It was kind of quite repressed. Mm-hmm. So I think there was something as well. I've said this before, but Gretchen from Gutter Snipe, they're just touring, they got a new album out. Gretchen's amazing, and she said to me at a security gig once, she's like, it's really nice to meet you. She's like, you need to understand that. We were talking about this in a fucking village in Wales. We're like, well, the guy from the Stretchheads is gay, so it must be all right. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, just being yourself was something at the time that was quite unique and quite a hard period in terms of people's identity. Now it feels like things are just, the fucking genie's out the bottle. It's great.
Yeah, but part of that is because of the groundwork that was done, in those difficult days.
If you research it, though, there was loads of queer people. I mean, Jean October from Chelsea was queer, but they never talked about it. Because it was the death of your fucking career. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, without going down this road, I can also completely agree in the liberating potential of a pseudonym. Having laboured in a band under my own name, started another project under a slightly absurd assumed identity, I was way more expressive and silly and playful, and actually the project ended up being more fun as a result because it was a break from yourself.
It's Dionysian, as I put it. Costumes are Dionysian, and I drive past the academy and I see some fucking name like I've never heard, and I just think, you fucking fake. Like, why don't you just make up a name for yourself? Why don't you just... I don't know, it just feels lazy, and also it feels egotistical to like use your name, and that sounds awful, but I've got some John Cale albums, it's like, I like Nico, but it's like actually that wasn't even her name. So I think there's something about just changing and altering and using it as a bit of a kind of calling card that feels different to I'm a singer-songwriter, and like a lot of the fucking neo-folk music that you absolutely, quite rightly, can't abide.
Gets a lot of mentions.
It is like, I'm a storyteller and my stories must be told. It's just bullshit, right?
I think it's also...
I was going to say, there's a really rich lineage of like becoming a character in all popular music, and it goes back like so far. And it's something I've personally always shrugged away from because I want to be authentically me on stage,
I think it's also a genre thing though. The stuff you do, the emo, the hardcore, that kind of stuff, it's less common. I mean, I know you've got Davey Havoc and all that kind of stuff, but it's less common, whereas in the more kind of esoteric, kind of like the noise rock and the kind of electronica and stuff like that, it's a bit more of you're allowed to play a bit more with that.
I mean, the thing is, for me, like, I don't write about myself when I'm writing music. Like, it's always characters I'm writing. I'm a bit like Bruce Springsteen almost, and that kind of approach. So it wouldn't be a massive leap for me to make that jump to like
tonight's the
be
night.
A character.
Tonight's the night.
It's not about me.
It's a very 70s, 76 punk thing as well. It's the first thing you did was come up with a name. You'd be Berlin or...
We did it last 2 weeks ago. We did it with Bruce and Derek. We did it with the podcast. We've got a tangential podcast now, the Bruce and Derek show. So there you go, Mark. It works. Phil. So as we kind of alluded to, there's a number of artists we've debated covering with yourself. Cat's out the bag with the fact that we want to do Coil at some point as well. We also, obviously, there's a lot to talk about with your own projects and tales, but we thought we would break the ice on getting you on the show with a band that absolutely needs a tour guide, which is Cabaret Voltaire. The choice of the record, yours. In a very, very quick nutshell, why Eight Crepuscule Tracks, which is the record we're going to cover today, and we'll come back to it in more detail later, but just very quickly, why?
I think it's hard to get hold of. It's a collection. It's actually a collection of a band in transition, and there is a period between kind of 81 and 83 where Cabaret Voltaire are poised to become actually a major label dance act. They still work their way through that in an industrial sensibility, but there's a sense of tension here where they're actually exploring it, and it's collecting these singles because I asked permission if compilations were allowed.
Well, we'll get back to that in a second.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is important, but Well, the other thought I had was actually Cabaret Voltaire are a fucking magnificent singles band. So it's trying to just capture a period, I think, a period of transition. And when I went back and listened to it, I just thought the material was so prescient. The material it's frightening and groovy at the same time. And actually some of the content, as we'll discuss, is actually very prescient to the political times at the moment. So I've chosen that as my favourite because it's something I can go back to and listen to it again and again, and it's a period that they've really nailed something. But there's also what you won't necessarily find in the rest of Cabaret Voltaire's back catalogue, a really interesting dark humour.
Yeah. I actually did notice that, and it wasn't something I was aware of prior to doing the deep dive, because Cabaret Voltaire are a band clearly that I've heard of. They're referenced by so many people. I've dipped in and out of them over the years. There's stuff that I thought, that's pretty good, but oh my goodness, see when you actually have to try and grasp the band and coalesce a thought about them, it's difficult because there are so many extremes in this band. I thought it was quite interesting that they transitioned away from what you might call a quite noisy experimental sound a few years before you were really gigging a lot with your own band. Otherwise, I could have imagined a scenario where you would potentially have crossed paths with them, because some of their early stuff is very caustic, it's very performative, it's very intense in a way that, you know, Stretchheads, your first project, was abrasive. And I can see how these two things could have shared the stage.
I think I always reflect on Stretchheads as being kind of Bogshed, but speeded up, really. But Bogshed comes from a lineage of Beefheart. You know, Beefheart's really important and almost a kind of motoric, kind of cosmish, you know, German influence, I think.
That's going to come.
So I think we were just speeding things up, but I was the one in the band that was also turning people on to Throbbing Gristle and Diamanda Gallas, and I was very rooted in that kind of industrial culture. And I guess I even in Umo with Johnny and Dom and Martin, I'm still the kind of the guy that's got the industrial reference points, the performance art reference points, and haven't lost sight of that and not become too rockist. And I'm very suspicious, not only suspicious of people that use their own name on stage, but I'm very suspicious of rockism. And I think Cabaret Voltaire, for me, absolutely dismantled rockism. I mean, they would take influences, as we'll discuss, they'll take influences from Eno and Roxy Music, but Roxy Music were a pop band and Roxy Music were rockist in comparison to where Cabaret Voltaire started going. I mean, they absolutely deconstructed what was happening at that point in music. But as we'll maybe discuss, they were skinheads, you know, they were taking the love of Stanley Kubrick and King Tubby and Can and kind of putting it through a mincer.
Yeah, so let's go through that a wee bit. We'll talk about the basics in the kind of simplified timeline here. So you get three core members, Richard H. Kirk, Stephen Melinder and Chris Watson. Stephen Melinder, we kind of shorthand refer to him as Mal.
Tend to refer to him as Mal. Sometimes people call Richard Kirky.
Yeah. They first got together in Sheffield in 73. They were named after the Zurich nightclub that was the birthplace of Dadaism. Mal describes himself and Kirk as growing up, as you say, on a diet of dub, ska and bluebeat. Watson and Kirk both describe being inspired by Brian Eno in the very early 70s and exploring tape loops and electronics from there. We'll come back to in a second. Watson was actually a telephone engineer and was able to create and obtain oscillators and signal generators to facilitate some of the experiments. Once the band takes a more structured form, I think bands like Suicide are a really kind of prominent reference if you're trying to kind of navigate the environment of what was going on.
Rocket USA.
So, as I say, they began in 73, but it actually took more than 5 years for them to start properly releasing music with the Mix Up album. I mean, there was a couple of bits and bobs before that, but they did keep a good archive of their early experimentation and recordings, which is very handy.
Yeah.
As a result, later retrospective collections like 74 to 76 give us some insight into their genesis. That they're fairly fascinating listens. I mean, if not exactly banger-laden summer, road trip gold mines, they're very, very nuanced and complex experimentations and illustrations of people finding themselves without any real instruction. It feels.
I think this kind of started out in Chris's attic. And they were just with tape machines and the methodology compilation that Mute eventually brought out. And also, as you say, that early compilation, which Throb and Gristle brought out on Industrial Records.
That's right, yeah.
And Cozy, Cozy's talked about that as well in the past and said, they kind of reached out because they felt like Clock DVA and Cabaret Voltaire particularly, and Richard brought out a solo album on Industrial. They found kindred spirits in a pretty barren landscape.
Yeah.
As I'd mentioned, the other really important Sheffield band are Clock DVA, who were equally exploring kind of performance art and tape loops and experimentation and doing happenings. Making people feel really, really uncomfortable. And I think that was the same territory that TG were exploring.
I believe also toured recently as well, didn't they?
Clock DVA, yeah.
That show.
To some extent, Clock DVA have never stopped. Saw them in Edinburgh last year. They were phenomenal.
That's right. Once they started playing live, Cabaret Voltaire would perform alongside bands like Joy Division fairly regularly. Both bands were part of the first Factory Records release. It was a compilation. And they, as you've mentioned here, they continued to have ties to Factory pretty much throughout their whole career, signing Les Disques du Crepuscule, which is a label in Belgium that was sort of like a kind of sister label to Factory Records, releasing all that stuff. And
it was kind of twin. It was Factory Benelux.
Yeah.
So you'll see quite a lot of Factory releases that would kind of spill over. But also importantly, Annick Honor, who was the co-founder of that label, ran Plan K in Brussels, which was a really important independent venue where a lot of bands, not just Factory bands, but rough trade bands would go over and perform. William Burroughs went over and did a performance there. And then also, interestingly, from a Glasgow point of view and from a Scottish point of view, bands like Joseph Kay were playing there. And it's interesting how Paul Haig ends up laterally collaborating with Cabaret Voltaire as well. So there was a weird kind of Scottish connection going on there.
Annick's the Love Will Tear Us Apart.
Yes, she was Ian Curtis's lover, but she'd worked as a music journalist for many years, and she was part of kind of hooking up with Tony Wilson and getting a lot of these bands over into Europe, and some pretty seminal shows I think happened over in Europe in terms of Joy Division's career. The Factory and the idea of Factory Records, I think it would have been interesting if Cabaret Voltaire had stayed on Factory perhaps, but I think they were too wild and too spiky and too scratchy really, and I think early on they immediately didn't want to become part of a boutique label. They wanted to kind of branch out on their own. Yeah. So as we'll discuss, they chose rough trade. They're
very integral to their community though. I mean, they actually kind of serve as like a bit of a gravitational centre for a lot of that in Sheffield. I mean, so in 1977, Chris Watson set up Western Works Studio. It was kind of key to the band's own output. Now, we've talked about the kind of Marxist qualities of Sheffield as a kind of very working class city. They set it up in a kind of, what was the plant used for?
It was Donnelly's utensil factory.
Yeah.
You have to remember Sheffield, it is Steel City. Yeah. So I actually went to an event there and there was a kind of supergroup formed with Eric Random and was it Nigel from in the Nursery and Mal and they did a few kind of songs that were recorded in Western Works and called themselves Ibison, which was the name of the scissor factory next door.
Oh wow.
Which was a really special event, and actually as a public health lead at the time for alcohol, it was fascinating because we were twinned with the University of Sheffield, and partway through the gig everything broke down and we were drinking really cheap beers, and then we were watching a projection on minimum unit pricing. So it's like, again, it's just it was almost like a kind of happening. But Western Works, is we'll maybe pick up on as well. Sheffield as a city, it's the Socialist Republic of Sheffield. Although obviously ended up with Nick Clegg as a Liberal Dem MP, it's a very left-leaning city. Tends to be very socialist in its perspective. So there was almost a Marxism of them very quickly getting access to the means of their own production, and using and exploiting the fact that they were a part of a London label, but very quickly saying we need control over this ourselves. We have this bank of material and we need an editing suite. We need somewhere to actually start doing that. But then, as you say, then that becomes a hub for a whole range of bands like Vice Versa that go on to become ABC, bands in Sheffield, The Future, which go on to become the Human League. All of these bands are then starting to kind of rotate around the central vortex, which is Cabaret Voltaire.
That's right. I mean, some of the alumni include that we've mentioned Clock DVA, but we also had Lydia Lunch. She was there.
She recorded there, yeah.
The box,
which is interesting. We'll maybe pick up on that.
I think Laybach did something there as well, and obviously New Order used it quite a bit. And it wasn't just even a recording hub, it was a social hub. It seemed that there was quite a lot of people just going there to be together, to hang, to socialise and that.
But that's an extension of the Sheffield scene at the time. There was a big art scene, there was a big art happening scene, there were a lot of confrontations. Obviously the first Cabaret Voltaire gig ends up with a riot, and Mal gets his back damaged.
His spine
he ends up in hospital. I mean, it's a very provocative kind of art space, and fanzines like Gun Rubber are categorising and they're capturing all of this kind of this cauldron that's happening in Sheffield, and proudly happening quite independent to what's happening in Manchester over the Pennines, and definitely proudly independent to what's happening in London. London was the enemy.
That's right. I mean, they signed to Rough Trade in '78 despite offers from Factory and actually from Throb and Gristle for Industrial, but it's quite well documented that both Cabaret Voltaire and The Fall and Marquis Smith in particular felt they were like the northern troublemakers on that imprint, and in that kind of canon of artists that Rough Trade had at the time.
Well, I mean, The Fall did their own thing through Step Forward Productions anyway for a few years. That was Miles Copeland, from drummer for the Police's brother.
IRS Records.
I became IRS Records. So
he wasn't the Spy, was he?
The father was in the CIA.
But basically, this is a whole other rabbit hole. But basically, the reason they kept touring the Middle East was so that they could take one of the members of the family over there, because he was secretly passing information on at the time. There's a whole thing there. We'll come back to that another day, right? Because Sting was like, "Can we play anywhere else bar the Middle East?" And they were like, "No, Sting, shut up."
They made a wedge. I think the Fall and being friends through Joe, being friends with Chris and Cozy, I've heard a very similar kind of story that Rough Trade, starting out with good intentions, but my God, the number of meetings that they would have as Marxists to decide whether they were going to release records or not. Meanwhile, you've got this powerhouse. And if you look even at the Rough Trade catalogue, which we'll talk about, the Cabaret Voltaire are producing, of albums and singles and EPs, and to some extent collaborations start to form as well. They're absolutely churning it out. Rough Trade couldn't really keep up, but also Rough Trade always had one eye to what was going to fund everything, what was going to be the next big thing. It starts out with Scritti Politti, and then it ends up being the Smiths, and then ultimately, as we were joking earlier on, it becomes the Wooden Tops. Good luck to the Wooden Tops, but they were never really going to set the Heather on fire. But it's this wishful thinking that somehow you're going to get a cash cow to pay for all the experimental stuff.
I think they also kind of agreed as well that as a label enjoys some success, they're probably less willing to take the same gamble they would have taken in earlier years. So the Wooden Tops,
decreases.
It starts to look like, we need to preserve this success, as opposed to being willing to exercise the same bravery that made you successful in the first place. You're sort of more concerned with trying to protect that, and so it makes you a bit more conservative.
But it means bands like the Cabs leave. It means bands like Chris and Cozy, who now in reflection everyone's like, my God, pioneering electronic musicians. But it wasn't music that was in vogue at the time. But you can go back to those records really, really easily. Many would say the Fall's glory period is probably the Beggars Banquet years, but I think their Rough Trade era is phenomenal. Certainly, again, as a singles band, my God, they're just churning it out. But when Mal says in an interview, we found out that basically it had taken Scritti Politti 2.5 years to write one album, and we'd brought out 4.
They were
like, wait a minute.
Really prolific. I mean, there's points where they're bringing out 2 and actually 3 records a year if you include live albums and stuff like that. I mean, that's like Beach Boys level sort of old school productivity.
And I think this is the thing with industrial culture, and I think I've heard Chris Carter talk about this as well. It's not it's not about being like aggressive and, you know, try to be kind of like rub people's face in it, as much as there is a bit of a holding a mirror up to society. It's actually about being industrious. It's actually about being in command and control of your own material, bringing it out when you choose to, bringing it out in formats that you want, and, you know, and also working your arse off. And, you know, all of these people, a lot of these people that I've met, not all of them, as we'll probably discuss in the Coil episode, but a lot of them, you know, they had day jobs. You know, Chris and Cozy are living in a one-bedroom flat in Soho with a kid, with Nick, their son, and Cozy's out stripping at night to make money, because Chris, God love him, he's building synthesizers, and there wasn't a lot of demand for that back in the day. He's an absolute genius, but he was pretty much unemployable in that regard. Meanwhile, Sleazy Pete and Jen have just signed a deal with Warner Brothers for £500,000, and they're getting like gold dildos made as promotional items. It was like, you know, when Throbbing Gristle kind of implodes, Chris and Cozy got the shitty stick, but they went to rough trade with some really radical and interesting stuff. But if they're waiting to be able to actually earn a living out of it, no wonder they ended up jumping ship just as the Fall did.
But I think, seeing as we're on the subject of context, before we dig into any of the albums, I do want to kind of set the scene very quickly. You know, what shaped the creation of Cabaret Voltaire and what were they part of in those formative years? The sound of the early stuff is extremely raw. That's not a euphemism, but it is just raw. It's unfiltered. It's, albeit it came out years later, it's beloved because of its honesty. And if you look at like the arrival of electronica, the sounds around the young Cabaret Voltaire, the three men, the members were all born in and around the mid-50s. I think it's like 53, 55, 56. For the benefit of ourselves as much as the audience, we want to try and work out what was happening around these young people. And I think for that era, we have to consider TV and film as much as anything, especially the pioneering sci-fi of that era. And when you hear the sounds, you know, what aspect of contemporary culture then was experimenting with electronic sounds and scores and music in a musical context?
It's Daphne Oram, and it
was filmed.
Daily,
I mean, so
it's Daily Derbyshire.
Yeah, the day the Earth stood still, 1951.
Outer Limits,
popularised the whole alien visitor genre, opened the door for, you know, electronic spacecraft and weaponry sounds, followed by War of the Worlds in 53, Forbidden Planet in 56, Them 54, I think that was. As well as like a slew of Japanese equivalents as well, excellent Japanese equivalents. You had people like Joe Meek in a late 50s kind of pop thing. He had an album called I Hear a New World. An Outer Space Musical Fantasy, it was 59.
The Blue Men.
And that is like, all kinds of strange samples, warped vocals, aggressive production in places, pushing the outer space theme as well seemed to kind of, it was almost as though they felt that they were trying to cushion the strangeness of these sounds by giving it this narrative, you know, as though the extraterrestrial theme made it easier for the audience to process the unfamiliarity of these sounds. Attilio Mineo. Man in Space with Sounds is a 1962 album. Now, bearing in mind, these guys are probably 7 or 8 years old watching these films.
I mean, stuff like Musique Concrète and John Cage are around, but I have to say, you know, these are these are three working class skinheads.
Yeah.
So I think you've nailed it in a way that it's popular culture actually that's maybe influencing them more.
Because that kind of high art thing doesn't, I don't think it comes into the equation until they're a good bit older.
I mean, TG had that with Coombe Transmissions. You know, they became part of a very high art scene. They were actually touring Europe as a performance art project before they'd even thought about doing Throbbing Gristle. So they come with a lot of those influences, whereas I think it feels like there's a more working class thing that comes from, well, actually, they were working class. Cozy was certainly working class, let's face it. But, you know, the cabs are coming from, they're like a little street gang, but they're listening to Roxy and they're listening, you know, the emo bits of Roxy. They're listening to Can, you know, and John Peel. They're listening to dub, and they're soul boys as well. They like their soul, and they like a wee bit, you know, Miles Davis. So it was a bit.
Let's get there, because I mean, you mentioned Delia Derbyshire. I don't want to leave her out. She should need little introduction at this point, but obviously, on one hand, celebrated for her work in Doctor Who, but her real legacy should be the barriers that she broke down with the Maid of Vale work that she did. Literally creating new sounds by sampling, distorting, looping at multiple banks of reel-to-reel machines at different rates and all kinds of other bespoke gadgets. And one other last nod of that era as well, Morton Subotnick, Silver Apples of the Moon, 1967. One of the first purely electronic records. It's percussive, it's abrasive, and it's a clear precursor, I think, to the work of Cabaret Voltaire. This is the fabric around these very young men. I mean, they're boys at that point. As they get older and they start to develop their own tastes, yes, we've got obvious examples of like the Beatles and Pink Floyd experimenting with certain sounds, and a lot of the early Jamaican dub stuff. But in terms of committed electronic experimentation and, you know, this new world of music that was emerging, it maybe feels a bit redundant to mention Kraftwerk, but they blew the gates open in 1970 with the debut album. That said, a lot of the early krautrock movement was actually largely real-world instrumentation. So, like, even that was Amandul to Phallus Dei, that very often cited inspirational album 69. The only digital instrument on that is electronic cymbals, whatever that means. I think that's just white noise filters. Even
Kraftwerk, when they started out, you know, I mean, they're part of this kind of Cosmish family, and what I like in a way about a lot of that stuff is that there weren't really any rules, but they become more and more purist. And I think when Autobahn lands, which my dad had a copy, I've still got his old copy. You know, that really blew the gates open, but and they don't get much credit because they're seen as a bit naff. But Tangerine Dream.
Yeah, that's true.
Actually really important and really interesting.
What I'm kind of gunning at here is just, again, we take it for granted, but the sheer condensed amount of time that this all unfolded in is stunning. So, as you say, we've discussed music concrete in here before. Pierre Schaeffer in the 40s kind of coined that term. You know, real-world sounds manipulated electronically via tape, splicing, reversing, slowing down. John Cage, his passion for randomness was key to the exploration of music, as was his instinct to embrace discomfort. I think that's really key to Cabaret Voltaire. Steve Reich, jarring kind of tape loops. Also that thing he did in 66, Come Out. With a looped sample of a kid who'd been arrested for murder. It's very dark, and it's the kind of thing that appears in Cabaret Voltaire when they start sampling the evangelical stuff. And we actually, funnily enough, don't want to not give her credit here. We end up maybe unexpectedly back at an arguably bigger influence on experimental sound than the Beatles themselves, Yoko Ono.
Yeah.
Because Yoko was a member of the experimental group Fluxus in 1968. Who in turn influenced this guy Cornelius Cardew, who he would go on to make what would probably be the first analog version of Harsh Noise. So I think when you hear the early stuff of this band, you're like, where the hell did these guys get these ideas? It's trying so far after the fact as we are to try and put ourselves in that moment and say, where were they getting these ideas? Because they are so close to the origin point. It's like, they are 30,000 years after the Big Bang, kind of like, no, it's literally electronic music has just arrived. It's not like now, where we've had plenty of time to let it, simmer and mature and evolve. It's just happened, and I think that's a really fascinating thing. So
I think that context is really useful, because it can be quite lame to say, oh, well, they're from the grim industrial north and they're just reflecting their environment, and they're falling to sleep at night with the sound of drop forges, which is, it's the Birmingham cliche, it's the Sheffield cliche, it's
the Judas Priest cliche.
Yeah. So it's like, it's important to think that they had their ears to the ground. People like John Peel were probably still quite important.
Absolutely.
The Perfume Garden was kind of playing quite weird shit. But I think in the middle of the night.
I want to kind of emphasise how they didn't grow up in a void or a vacuum. They were influenced and influenced others. But like, I think it's just a fascinating how close they were to that origin point of this entire thing that we take for granted now. So I mean, Music Concrete up to Cab Vol is 24 years. By point of reference, right, from now, that is the Strokes' debut album, right? That is like Turn on the Bright Lights by Interpol. It's Suicide Invoice by Hot Snakes. It's that stupid Brackets album by Sigur Rós, or it's McCluskey Do Dallas. That's a heartbeat. These feel like albums that, I mean, these are records that in some cases I still listen to. And from the spinning spacecraft noises in War of the Worlds up to Cabaret Voltaire, that's 10 years. That's Life of Pablo by Kanye. That's what Anti by Rihanna. It's even that entire movement around bands like Gloss, Transday Revenges. That seems literally, that's a blink of an eye. And Cabaret Voltaire were that close to the absolute beginnings, the proto stage of this entire movement. And I think we as modern listeners, and I'm just bearing in mind that a lot of the audience will be our age and younger, it's like, really try and think of that. Like, this is how early on they were in that movement and how pioneering this actually is as we're working our way through it. So yeah, I think they need some acknowledgement of like the scale of that achievement and the scale of their adventures. When you, especially when listening to 74, 76 stuff, where did they sit in the scene of their time as they started making music? Well, they've actually got a record entitled Electropunk to Technopop, and I think the punk reference opens up another small conversation here. Cabaret Voltaire and punk. Cabaret Voltaire began before punk exploded. So they got together in 73, they were playing shows not long after, but the first record mix-up didn't land until 79. Sonically, I think we can agree that Cabaret Voltaire are not a punk act by most definitions, but ideologically it does feel like they share a lot of DNA, the working classness, the confrontational nature of it, the performative aspect of it. They've talked about, well, I think when punk is discussed, a lot of people refer to Guy Debord and the Society of the Spectacle, situationism. There was an existing dialogue and a movement in place for making satirical and critical points about society and culture in quite performative ways.
Can I just jump in there and say Stuart Home disagrees with you quite profusely on that?
He does.
I love that episode, I have to say.
He does. I mean, Cabaret Voltaire don't consider themselves part of that either.
Because they're Dadaist. They're not
exactly. So
but I think Dadaism and situationism do kind of sit alongside each other, and there's something about the absurdity of the spectacle that they were working on.
Yeah,
and then laterally, when we look at this period, particularly the album we're looking at in that period, they're deliberately confronting how absurd fascism is and how absurd religion is.
There is a lot
which is quite situationist. situationist.
There is absolutely a lot of absurdism in that. And I mean, their early performances, as you've talked about, I mean, some of those early gigs resulted in just riots. And they weren't musical in the slightest. They were purely confrontational, provocative.
Aye.
In their
And they weren't
nature.
alone in doing that. I mean, the early Clock DVA performances were using like entrails and stuff. And there was like, Herman Nietzsche style stuff in like a students' union in Sheffield, I mean, no fucks given.
Mal told the Quietus, the whole Dada thing was always a touchstone for us. We've been through punk before punk happened because we were connected with Dada and its non-conformity, flying in the face of authority and the bourgeois. It was kind of art and anti-art. And I think musically, certainly it feels more intuitive listening to the stuff, being familiar with the stuff, that Throbbing Gristle, maybe the Residents, had far more of a musical influence on the output of Cabaret Voltaire than certainly the Sex Pistols et al. But punk is a lot of things and did a lot of things. Many of them are up for debate, but we can likely agree that it broke down a lot of barriers in terms of popularising the idea of counterculture movements and broadening support for outsider art. I think punk,
it definitely blew people's ears open.
Yeah, I think rather than reflecting on the impact that punk, as a narrow definition, had on the band as makers of music, I think it's much more relevant to look at the effect that punk had on audiences.
Yeah.
As you say, blowing their ears open, like blowing open the boundaries of how subversive you could be, and also how subversion could actually be received quite warmly and go on to become quite successful. I don't mean successful in a Bay City Rollers way. I mean...
Well, arguably it's...
Well, it certainly could. It certainly could, but...
Certainly did.
Still Joey Ramone's favourite band.
The extremity of the band's sound and their performative approach, as we've said, initially had them really bumping off crowds to notable effect. The brawl at the first show, Mal leaving with a chipped backbone due to the things that had been thrown at them. But that hostility seemed to somewhat ease following that 77 explosion. And suddenly, even though they didn't sonically sound like it, they were met with a public that just seemed more willing, or at least a subculture that seemed more willing to reckon with being confronted and challenged.
But I think their industriousness, like a lot of the bands at the time in this family of kind of industrial noise, they test out their metal in live performance. Mm-hmm. TG toured their arse off, and they were playing in really they played in really uncomfortable environments as well, quite deliberately provocative. And Cabaret Voltaire, as you've said, as they were producing these studio records, they're also producing live records, and they're doing live documentation, and they're recording what they're doing, but they're also really working and touring at a time also, a lot of the rough trade bands were the same, they were all kind of touring about, and even bands like the Raincoats and the Pop Group, and all of these bands. I mean, the student union circuit was really important. There was a whole network up and down the UK that people could do and they could still tap onto. That's probably rooted in like 60s show bands, but there were all these little places. But what punk did as well was it allowed people to DIY things, and you could kind of you could have these little small confrontational shows and build a scene and build a community by doing that. And the Cabs still to this day, I mean, they're now in their form that they are now, they're touring again, but I think the live performance is where you really experience the real deal.
I think you can imagine this scenario though, when punk and the idea of provocation became almost the currency of the genre, if we can agree on anything being the currency of the genre, whether it was political or simply artistic or nihilistic or whatever, audiences were turning up to be provoked. Yeah. And that in itself is a massive development for a band that is willing to go to the extremes as that Cabaret Voltaire were willing to go to in those early days. I'd like to do a little brief counterfactual and just the two of you kind of brainstorm this. How do you think things would have panned out for Cabaret Voltaire if the punk rock movement hadn't happened?
I mean, a bit like TG, they would have ended up being a niche art project, I think. And, they might have ended up ironically landing in the same kind of academic kind of credentials that they've subsequently got. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a bit of a chin stroker.
Aye.
Yeah, I mean, I think they would definitely have that. Academic is probably the best way of thinking about it, The way they kind of approached making music was very much, you mentioned earlier on, Phil, was deconstructionist, right? Like, that's very much a Dadaist technique. I think they probably would have ended up in the same situation. And I also think their trajectory musically would have been vastly different as well, because they do become essentially a post-punk band. I think they're definitely hearing stuff in the era, and they're coming to it, and it's informing what they're doing. You know, I think we'll talk about that as we get further into this.
I think the other big shift we'll definitely talk about is that they cease being a band and they become a video, and they just become the media.
Yeah.
And then they merge, a bit like Chris when he eventually leaves the band. He just becomes part of the media because that's what they were really interested in.
Yeah.
What I'd probably also just kind of drop in though is the fact that whatever their sound was in this period, I guess them getting some recognition probably comes as a result of punk, but what they end up morphing into is like so far away from it.
Yeah.
And there's so much American black music in their music as well, which is just is so far removed from what a lot of.
I think there's a lot of Caribbean black music in there.
I mean,
dub,
they're
funk,
soul. They're so close to being a P-punk band, a P-funk band in places that it's actually quite odd.
I've
to
seen
be honest.
the Parliament references come up quite a lot.
Very often, you know, it's one of the first things that kind of stuck out to me, and I think that was a huge part of their musical DNA as well.
Yeah, and they're always citing black music. They're always citing, you know, Beat Generation authors like William Burroughs. They're lifting quite heavily from Burroughs, and then they're citing black music as their inspiration. And then when they do get the capacity to be able to actually travel about properly, they go to Haiti, they go to New York, they end up working, as we will talk about, with some of the shining lights of hip hop. They end up, you know,
Chicago house sounds.
Absolutely, they end up in Detroit and Chicago, and in a way, the tension and the balance is that they're ahead of the curve one week and then they're behind the curve the next because things are moving so fast.
Even with the studio, one of the first things they start to do is build up the kit that the likes of Lee Perry were using. You know, the copycat kind of the delays and all these kind of like tools of these genres as well.
They're using that, and they're bringing a kind of hard funk that's happening. And I loved your episode, actually. It's happening at the same time as No Wave. So they're bringing that kind of like hard funk edge and lifting from like defunk and lifting from stuff that's happening with the contortions.
There was definitely a chaotic abandon and fearlessness to that era where all bets were off. It was like, let's just make a fucking mess.
Yeah, I mean, Parliament did that as well.
Yeah,
Parliament did that with funk. That was the most beautiful thing about George Clinton. You know, it's like it just was madness.
Still to my day, and I say this on the walking tour, the loudest fucking gig I've ever been at was Parliament Funkadelic. 17 people on stage, and he threatened to bring 36 people onto the stage. It was just like organs were moving around, and I've seen loads of fucking hard metal in my day. The thing with No Wave, I just want to quickly go back to it. The connection with Lydia Lunch was that she came over and she recorded in Limbo, and she then I mean, I can't assume, but she then starts her own record label. She starts Widowspeak Productions. She starts her own record label, and Paul Smith, who went on to basically curate Blast First and became the Cabaret Voltaire manager and set up Double Vision, helped them set up Double Vision video production. He'd invited Lydia over, and it was Lydia that then turned Paul Smith on to Sonic Youth. She's like, you need to see Sonic Youth, you need to get into this band. And then, you know, Paul brings out the uncensored Lydia Lunch cassette on Rough Trade, and then he goes to Rough Trade and he's like, oh, what about this band? This band's got they're on SST in the States, but they've got this new album, Bad Moon Rising. How about we release it and license it for the UK? And he starts Blast First Records. So again, like, Cabaret Voltaire and Western Works becomes this kind of like nexus.
I mean, without getting too meta about it, I do get the sense that period of the kind of mid to late 70s, not just because of the punk movement, because that's easy to be distracted by that, but it's probably the freest point of contemporary music.
Yeah, I would say so.
You know,
because you've also
the
got
lawlessness of it, and
it's really exciting.
Yeah, we've got Boy doing his thing in Berlin, you know, which is bringing in so much weird shit that you would never hear into the popular consciousness.
That's the point. It's the fact that you could do extremist outsider art, but also potentially succeed commercially, make it sustainable.
You could get by. I mean, Heroes didn't sell that much, to be fair, at the time.
He did all right in the long run, though.
It worked out all right for him, but, you know, hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
But if you can bring in Cluster, you can bring in Robert Fripp, and you can frame it and reframe it, and then with a bit of pizzazz from Emo, create something. And
Emo, by the way.
Emo.
Smart, the Emo.
I wish it was Eno. I wish it was even a quarter of Emo. A tenth of Eno.
So let's kind of navigate this story via the discography, right? We'll skirt through this. We're not going to dwell on any of the releases for any real length of time, because there's too many of them, frankly, but we are going to use them as kind of stepping stones to work our way through the story. We won't even touch the sides in terms of Cabaret Voltaire's myriad offshoots, the solo works, the collaborations. Please don't hate on us. We have lives and jobs.
And also, full disclosure, my very good friend Simon Dell is the encyclopedia electronica when it comes to bands like Cabaret
By the
Voltaire.
way,
So
Simon contributed some props to today's show, didn't he?
He contributed a couple of
Do you want to flash these to the camera, Phil? We'll describe
this
them.
is actually mine, but this is
Tottenham Court Road, Friday, August the 3rd.
an original
What year is that?
poster. 1979.
79.
So this is an original poster of TG, Cabaret Voltaire and Rema Rema, which I've actually got
£2.
signed by Dorothy Max. £2. And I think that's the gig that becomes live at the YMCA that Cabaret Voltaire then release. Rema Rema, very important band if you get a chance to see the documentary. And then we will talk about this, but
careful with this one.
I'm very careful because this is quite fragile, but this is an original poster for Slugging for Jesus, which is one of the singles we're going
Pope
to...
John Paul.
JP.
Quite,
Neil JP.
quite subversive at the time, I'd imagine.
Well, at the time, probably quite offensive to some people. So, there's a couple of things. I brought some books as well, and I brought the original 12s that the album we're talking about is based on. But we can preview that, as you say, with some of the rough trade stuff.
Yeah, so before we actually get dug into the discography, I think we'll pause there. And for listeners of the show who maybe aren't familiar with Cabaret Voltaire, or maybe are, who've been intrigued by what we've discussed so far, we're going to come back and we're going to get into that discography in detail. We're going to pick Phil's brains for all he's worth, and just chart the journey that this band went on across decades.
I'm smiling because you've done your own research as well, and I'm really curious about your take on this stuff.
Phil,
because I'm an old hack.
If there is a mantra for this modern reform-electing Brexit era that we live in, it's do your own research. Right, so we'll see you on the internet next week.
Yeah.
Tinfoil hats back on.
See you then.